Sometimes life knocks you down so hard, you forget what it feels like to hope. Evan Strickland knew that feeling well. At 45, he stood in front of a rusted storage unit door with his daughter Clara on a quiet Saturday morning. The manager had warned them not to waste their time. The unit had been abandoned for 30 years, nothing inside but trash. But Evan was desperate for anything that might help him and Clara start over after his divorce and layoff. When they pulled open that heavy door, they expected garbage. Instead, they found mountains of black bags stuffed with old clothes, broken furniture, and dusty boxes. But buried beneath it all was something nobody expected: vintage film reels, rare artwork, prototype inventions, and journals signed by people who became legends. What would they do with what they found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Evan Strickland had sat in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, listening to words that would dismantle 18 years of his life in under 10 minutes. "We appreciate your dedication to Harman Manufacturing," the HR director said, not quite meeting his eyes. She was younger than him, probably 30 at most, reading from a script she'd delivered dozens of times that week. "Unfortunately, due to market conditions and operational restructuring, your position has been eliminated." Eliminated. As if he were a line item on a spreadsheet, rather than a man who'd arrived early and stayed late for nearly 2 decades, who knew every machine on that factory floor by sound alone, who'd trained half the people who still had jobs. He'd nodded, signed the papers, and walked out with a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a photo of Clara from her high school graduation, and a plaque nobody would ever read. 18 years compressed into objects that barely filled a box. The divorce papers had arrived 2 weeks later. Patricia hadn't been cruel about it. If anything, she'd been too kind, which somehow made it worse. They'd sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where Clara had done her homework, where life had happened in the ordinary way it does, until suddenly it doesn't. "We've been roommates for years, Evan," Patricia had said quietly. "You know we have." He did know. The knowing made it hurt in a different way, not sharp, but dull and persistent, like a bruise that wouldn't heal. "I want you to be happy," she'd continued. "I want me to be happy." We deserve that much. They divided their life with the same practical efficiency they'd applied to everything else. She kept the house. She'd found a good job as an office manager and could afford the mortgage. He took his truck, his tools, and half of their meager savings. Clara, 22 and freshly graduated with a business degree she didn't know what to do with, had chosen to go with him. "Dad needs someone," she'd told her mother, and Evan had felt grateful and guilty in equal measure. His daughter shouldn't have to take care of him. That wasn't how this was supposed to work. They'd moved to Millfield 3 weeks ago, a town small enough that everyone knew your business, but large enough that nobody particularly cared. Population 8,000, tucked into the hills of western Pennsylvania, where the autumn colors were just beginning, their slow burn across the ridges. Evan had found a rental house on Oak Street, 2 bedrooms, peeling paint, a porch that sagged slightly on one side. It was the kind of place you lived when you were starting over or giving up, and he wasn't sure which category he fell into. The house had come partially furnished with mismatched pieces the landlord hadn't bothered to remove. A couch with sunken cushions, a kitchen table that wobbled, curtains that had been white in some distant past. Clara had tried to make it cheerful, buying a few throw pillows, hanging some of her college posters, but they both knew they were play-acting at domesticity. Their routine had settled into something quiet and careful. Mornings, Evan made coffee while Clara scrolled through job listings on her laptop. Afternoons, he'd drive around town looking for help-wanted signs while she worked on her resume. Evenings, they'd eat whatever was cheap and filling, then retreat to their separate rooms. They were polite with each other, considerate, but there was a distance neither of them knew how to bridge. The distance had started years ago, Evan realized. When Clara was 15, he'd been working double shifts to pay for the house they'd just lost. When she was 17 and applying to colleges, He'd been too exhausted to talk about her dreams beyond asking if she'd chosen something practical. When she was 20 and changing her major from graphic design to business, he'd praised her for being sensible, never asking if it was what she really wanted. Now here they were, two people who loved each other but didn't quite know how to be together anymore. The money was running out. Evan had applied to every manufacturing facility, warehouse and construction company within 30 miles. A few had called him back for interviews, but when they saw his age, their interest cooled. 45 wasn't old, but it wasn't young either, and there were plenty of applicants with fewer years and lower salary expectations. His unemployment benefits wouldn't last forever, and his share of the savings was dwindling faster than he'd anticipated. He'd started taking walks through downtown Millfield, partly to save gas, partly to avoid seeing the worry on Clara's face when she thought he wasn't looking. The town had the slightly faded charm of places that had been prosperous once, decades ago. Main Street had the usual assortment of businesses: a diner called May's Place, a hardware store, an antique shop with dusty windows, a coffee house that doubled as a used bookstore. Buildings from the 1920s, with ornate cornices and tall windows that had watched generations come and go. It was during one of these walks that Evan had noticed the storage facility on the edge of town. Valley Storage, a collection of long, low buildings with red metal doors, surrounded by a chain-link fence. A hand-painted sign out front read, "Units available, climate and non-climate." He'd walked past it 3 times before curiosity made him stop. The office was attached to the front building, and through the window he could see a man hunched over a desk, working on a crossword puzzle. Evan had gone in mostly to waste time, to have a conversation with someone who didn't know he was unemployed and directionless. The manager was in his 60s, with a weathered face and calloused hands that suggested he'd done harder work before settling into this quiet job. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he had the slow, measured way of speaking common to men who'd learned that most problems solved themselves if you waited long enough. "Help you?" Dale had asked, not unfriendly, but not particularly interested either. "Just curious what your rates are," Evan had said, though he had nothing to store. Dale had listed prices that Evan couldn't afford, then returned to his puzzle. But something made Evan linger, looking at the bulletin board, covered with notices and business cards. "You new in town?" Dale asked after a moment. "A few weeks now. Looking for work?" "That obvious?" Dale shrugged. "Lot of folks come through looking for storage rates they can't afford. Usually means they're between situations." They'd talked for 20 minutes, the kind of rambling conversation that men have when neither has anywhere pressing to be. Dale had mentioned he'd worked at Harman Manufacturing himself, back in the 80s, before his back gave out. He understood about eliminated positions and restructuring. As Evan was leaving, Dale had called after him. "Got a unit here, 47. Been abandoned for 30 years, payment just lapsed. I'm supposed to clean it out, but I'm putting it off because I guarantee it's full of junk." "Okay," Evan had said, not sure why Dale was telling him this. "If you and that daughter of yours want to clear it out, you can keep whatever's in there. Sell it, trash it, whatever. Save me the trouble." Evan had hesitated. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just junk nobody wanted. Owner died, no next of kin that could be located, trust fund finally ran dry. Been meaning to deal with it for months." Dale had fixed him with a look that was almost kind. "Sometimes folks need a project even if it's hauling garbage. Gives you something to do while you're figuring out what's next." Evan had told Clara about it that evening, over microwaved spaghetti. She'd looked up from her phone, the first real spark of interest he'd seen in her eyes in weeks. "Free stuff we could sell?" "Probably junk," he'd cautioned. "Or maybe not. Either way, it's something to do." They'd agreed to check it out Saturday morning. Neither had expected much. But standing there now, with that rusted door before them, and the unknown stretching ahead, Evan felt something he hadn't felt in months. A small, stubborn flicker of curiosity about what might come next. He gripped the handle, cold and rough with rust, and pulled. The door rolled up with a metallic screech that echoed across the empty parking lot. Dust motes danced in the morning light that spilled into the darkness beyond. Clara moved closer, peering inside. Oh my God! The unit was crammed full, floor to ceiling. Black trash bags, cardboard boxes, what looked like furniture draped in old sheets. The smell of decades rolled out. Musty paper, old fabric, that particular scent of time passing without witness. Dale wasn't kidding about the junk, Evan said. But Clara was already stepping inside, pulling her phone's flashlight on. Dad, look at this! She'd found a box near the front, taped brittle with age. Inside were books, their pages yellowed but intact. Hardcovers from the 1960s, first editions by the look of them. Evan picked up a faded photograph album from another box. The cover was worn leather, embossed with initials he couldn't quite make out. He opened it carefully. Black and white photographs. People in clothes from another era, at parties and protests and gatherings he couldn't identify. This isn't just junk, Clara said quietly. Evan looked around the unit with new eyes. Someone's life was in here. Someone's history, packed away and forgotten. The thought made him inexplicably sad, but also intrigued. I guess we'd better start sorting, he said. They'd brought boxes and trash bags, expecting to fill them quickly and haul everything to the dump. Instead, they found themselves moving carefully, examining each item before making a decision. It was slow work, and by noon they'd barely made a dent. But for the first time since the layoff, since the divorce, since everything had fallen apart, Evan felt like he was doing something that mattered, even if he couldn't quite explain why. Clara seemed to feel it too. They worked side by side, and when their hands brushed reaching for the same box, they both smiled, a real smile, not the polite ones they'd been trading for months. We should come back tomorrow, Clara said, as they prepared to leave for the day. Yeah, Evan agreed. We should. He didn't know it yet, but pulling open that storage unit door was the first right decision he'd made in a very long time. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected packages, buried under 30 years of dust and forgotten dreams, waiting for someone desperate enough to look past the surface and see what might be worth saving. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find out what matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, the junk turns out to be treasure after all. The second day started with coffee from May's place and a sense of purpose Evan hadn't felt in months. Clara met him in the kitchen at 7, already dressed in old jeans and a Millfield State sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Ready to dig through more garbage? She asked, but there was lightness in her voice. Ready to find more treasures, he corrected, surprising himself with the optimism. They worked steadily through the morning, developing a system. Clara would open bags and boxes, calling out what she found. Evan would sort items into piles, obvious trash, possible value, needs research. The trash pile grew fastest. Water-damaged paperbacks, clothes too deteriorated to salvage, broken kitchen items, rusted tools. But the possible value pile grew too. More photograph albums, vintage magazines in decent condition, a collection of vinyl records still in their sleeves. Nothing spectacular, but items that might fetch a few dollars each at a yard sale or online. By 11, they'd cleared enough space to move deeper into the unit. The back corner remained untouched, towers of boxes that looked more carefully packed than the rest. Let's take a break, Clara suggested, wiping dust from her forehead. My allergies are killing me. They sat on the concrete outside the unit, drinking water and watching clouds drift across the October sky. A few other people came and went, loading and unloading their own storage units, but mostly the facility was quiet. You know what's weird? Clara said after a while. We've found photo albums, books, records, even old clothes, but nothing personal. No letters, no documents with names. Evan hadn't thought about it, but she was right. Everything felt curated somehow, as if someone had deliberately removed anything too identifying. Maybe they didn't want to be found, he said. Or maybe the good stuff is in the back. They returned to work with renewed energy, tackling the carefully stacked boxes in the rear corner. These were different from the garbage bags and hastily packed boxes near the front. These had been sealed with proper packing tape, labeled with dates but no descriptions. Clara opened one marked 1969-1970 and gasped. Dad, "You need to see this." Inside, nestled in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were film reels. Not home movies. These were professional 16mm reels in metal canisters, each one labeled in neat handwriting. Clara lifted one out carefully. "Woodstock rehearsals, August 1969, she read aloud. "Dad, this says Woodstock." Evan took the canister, examining it. The metal was tarnished but intact, the label faded but legible. He opened it carefully. Inside, the film looked remarkably well preserved, wound tightly on its reel. "Could be anything," he said, trying not to get excited. "Could be someone's vacation footage they labeled wrong." But there were more. A dozen canisters, all labeled with dates and locations from 1968 to 1974. Newport Folk Festival, July 1968. Chicago, August 1968. Altamont, December 1969. "These are major events," Clara said, pulling up searches on her phone. "These are historic concerts and festivals." "Dad, if these actually contain footage from these events, that's a big if. But if they do," she was scrolling frantically now. "Unseen footage from Woodstock can sell for thousands. Tens of thousands if it shows the right performers." Evan felt a flutter in his chest, hope mixed with caution. He'd learned not to count on windfalls. "We don't even know if the film is any good. It's been sitting here for 30 years. 30 years in a sealed metal canister, in a climate-controlled unit," Clara counted. "That's actually pretty ideal for film preservation." They spent the next hour carefully extracting all the film reels, counting as they went. 17 canisters total, spanning 6 years of what looked like documentation of the counterculture movement. Whoever had filmed this had been present at moments that shaped a generation. "We need to get these looked at," Clara said. "Properly. By someone who knows what they're doing. That costs money. Dad, if even one of these is authentic..." She stopped, taking a breath. "Okay, let's think about this. We need information first." She'd already pulled up her laptop from the truck, sitting cross-legged on the concrete outside the unit. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for information about vintage film, preservation, authentication. Evan watched her work, remembering the little girl who used to sit exactly like that doing homework, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. When had she grown into this capable young woman? When had he stopped noticing? "There's a guy in Pittsburgh," Clara said after 20 minutes of research. "Dr. Philip Saunders at the Carnegie Museum. He's a film historian, specializes in documentary footage from the 60s and 70s. His email is listed on the university website. Think he'd look at them? Only one way to find out." She was already typing an email, explaining their situation, asking if he'd be willing to examine the reels or recommend someone who could. While Clara handled the digital side, Evan returned to the boxes. If there were film reels, what else might be hidden back here? The next box contained camera equipment. Not consumer-grade home movie cameras, but professional gear. A Bolex 16mm camera, lenses wrapped individually in cloth, light meters, filters. Evan had no idea about value, but the weight and build quality suggested these weren't toys. Another box held sound equipment, microphones, cables, what looked like a portable recording device. All carefully packed, all professional grade. "Clara, there's more!" She came to look, her eyes widening. Whoever owned this was seriously documenting things. This isn't amateur hour equipment. They worked faster now, energized by discovery. More boxes revealed more surprises, notebooks filled with handwriting, technical specifications, shot lists. Whoever this person was, they'd approached their work methodically. But it was Clara who found the real treasure. "Dad," she said, her voice strange. "Come here now." She was holding a canister different from the others, larger and heavier. The label read simply, "Woodstock Rehearsals, Private, August 14th, 1969. August 14th was the day before the festival officially started, Clara said, reading from her phone. That was when performers were doing sound checks and rehearsals. Some of the most famous musicians in the world just jamming together before everything went crazy. Evan felt his heart actually skip. "How much would that be worth?" "I don't know. But she showed him her phone screen, an article about rare Woodstock footage. 2 years ago, someone found 15 minutes of rehearsal footage and sold it at auction for $47,000. And that was just one performance. They stared at each other, the weight of possibility settling over them. "We can't get ahead of ourselves," Evan said, but his voice shook slightly. "We don't know if it's real. We don't know if the film is any good. We don't know anything yet," Clara agreed. "But Dad, what if it is real? What if this is actually valuable?" Evan sat down heavily on a box, suddenly dizzy. $47,000. That was more than he'd made in a year at the factory. That was enough to... He stopped himself. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you careless. "Let's not tell anyone," he said carefully. "Not until we know what we have." "Can we do that?" Clara nodded. "We should take these home. Keep them safe." They loaded the film canisters into boxes, padding them with bubble wrap Clara had bought for packing dishes. The camera equipment went in the truck too, handled with new reverence. As they prepared to leave, Dale appeared, walking slowly across the parking lot. "How's it going?" he called. "Mostly junk," Evan said, the lie coming easily. "But we're making progress." Dale nodded, satisfied. "Take your time. No rush." Driving home, neither of them spoke much. The boxes of film reels sat in the back seat, suddenly precious. Evan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if they might disappear. At the house, they carried everything inside carefully, setting it all in Clara's room, since it had a lock on the door. "What now?" Clara asked. "Now we wait," Evan said. "See if that museum guy responds. And tomorrow we keep sorting. There might be more." That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those film reels, about the person who'd filmed them, about why they'd been abandoned. $47,000 for 15 minutes. What if they had ours? But more than the money, something else nagged at him. Whoever had created this archive had been at the center of cultural history. They'd witnessed moments that defined a generation, and then they'd packed it all away and disappeared. Why? What kind of person walks away from something like that? And what else might be waiting in that storage unit, buried under 30 years of dust and silence, ready to change everything? Dr. Saunders replied Monday morning. Clara practically shouted when the email notification appeared on her laptop. Evan was making breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, the breakfast of people watching their budgets, when she came running into the kitchen, phone in hand. "He wants to see them. He can meet us Wednesday at his office." The next 2 days felt like the longest of Evan's life. They returned to the storage unit, but everything seemed different now. They moved through boxes with new attention, examining each item not just for obvious value, but for context, for clues about who had owned all this. The photograph albums became their focus. Clara documented every page with her phone camera, while Evan studied the faces. The same people appeared repeatedly. Young, intense, dressed in the fashion of the late 60s and early 70s. At concerts, at protests, in what looked like communal living spaces. One photograph stopped him cold. A group of people sitting in a circle outside, what looked like a farmhouse, guitars and notebooks scattered around them. The photo was dated 1969 on the back, and someone had written, "The Commune Summer Session." "Clara, look at this." She came over, studying the image. A commune. That makes sense. Lots of artists and activists lived collectively back then. But which commune? Where? They searched online for communes in Pennsylvania during that era and found dozens. The Back to Land movement had been strong in these hills, attracting artists, musicians, writers and filmmakers who wanted to create alternative ways of living. "It could have been anywhere within 100 miles, Clara said. "We need more information." They found it in a box of old concert programs and flyers. Mixed in with promotional materials from festivals and shows was a hand-drawn map, faded but still legible. It showed a property labeled Riverlight Collective, with directions from the nearest town, which happened to be Millfield. "Riverlight," Evan said slowly. "That's a name, right? Or a place?" Clara was already searching. "There's nothing current, but look at this." She showed him a newspaper article from 1973, archived in the Millfield Gazette's online collection. "Local arts commune faces uncertain future," the headline read. The article described Riverlight Collective as a community of artists, musicians, and filmmakers who had established themselves on an old farm property in 1967. By 1973, most members had moved on, and the collective was, essentially, defunct. "This is it," Clara breathed. "This is where all this came from." That afternoon, they made their first sale. Clara had listed some of the vintage concert posters online. Items they had multiples of, nothing that seemed critical to the main collection. An original poster from a 1970 Grateful Dead concert sold within hours for $320. Evans stared at the notification on Clara's laptop, unable to quite process it. "That's real money," he said. "That's one poster, Dad. We have dozens." They spent the evening cataloguing what they'd found so far, creating a spreadsheet with descriptions, conditions, estimated values based on online research. The numbers added up quickly, even being conservative, even assuming most items would fetch far less than premium examples. They were looking at potentially thousands of dollars. "We need to be smart about this," Evans said. "Not to rush into selling everything at once." Clara nodded. "We should focus on duplicates first. Save the unique stuff until we understand what we have." It felt strange, sitting at their wobbly kitchen table making business plans. 2 weeks ago, Evan had been sending out resumes and getting rejection emails. Now he was calculating the potential value of vintage protest art. "I keep thinking about the person who owned all this," Clara said quietly. "They documented so much history. Why would they just abandon it? People have their reasons, but these are their memories. Their work. You don't just walk away from that." Evan thought about the boxes of his own possessions he'd left behind in the divorce. Things that had seemed important once, but didn't matter when everything fell apart. Sometimes walking away was easier than facing what you'd lost. Wednesday arrived with autumn rain, the kind that made the hills disappear into grey mist. They drove to Pittsburgh carefully, the box of film reels secured in the back seat, wrapped in blankets like precious cargo. Dr. Saunders' office was in the Carnegie Museum's archive building, a converted warehouse that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. The historian himself was in his 70s, with wild white hair and glasses that magnified his eyes to an almost comical degree. "You've brought me something interesting, I hope," he said, gesturing them into a workspace lined with film equipment. They showed him the reels one by one. His expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention, and finally to something like awe. "Where did you say you found these?" "A storage unit," Evans said. "They'd been abandoned." Dr. Saunders lifted the Woodstock canister with hands that trembled slightly. "Do you have any idea what you might have here?" "We were hoping you could tell us. I can tell you that if these are authentic, and the canisters, the labeling, the preservation all suggest they might be, you found something extraordinary." He looked up at them, serious now. "But I need to examine the footage itself. That requires proper equipment and time. I could give you a preliminary assessment by next week. How much would that cost?" Evan asked, his stomach sinking. "Nothing. If these are what I think they are, this is my privilege." Dr. Saunders smiled. "And if they're authentic, you'll need authentication documents for insurance and eventual sale. I can provide those as well." They left the reels with him, each one carefully logged and receipted. Driving home, Evan felt oddly bereft, as if they'd left something precious behind. "We did the right thing," Clara assured him. "We need to know what we have." "I know. It's just," he struggled to articulate it. "What if this is it? What if this is our chance to get back on our feet, and we're trusting it to a stranger?" "He's not a stranger. He's an expert. And Dad, we have his name, his office, his university affiliation. He's not going to steal film reels from us." Evan knew she was right, but the fear remained. He'd learned the hard way that stability was an illusion, that everything you counted on could disappear between one day and the next. Back at the storage unit, they continued their work with new focus. More posters emerged, which Clara photographed and listed for sale. More photographs, which Evans studied for clues about Riverlight and its inhabitants. On Friday, they found the protest poster. It was at the bottom of a box, wrapped in tissue paper gone brittle with age. When Clara unfolded it carefully, they both caught their breath. The poster was hand-painted, not printed, gouache on heavy paper, colors still vibrant. It showed a raised fist against a sunrise, with text reading March on Washington, August 28, 1963. Along the bottom, in smaller text, "We shall overcome." But it was the signatures that made Clara's hands shake. Scrawled across the border in various inks and pencils were dozens of names. Some she didn't recognize, but others. "Dad, these are civil rights leaders. These are people who marched with Dr. King." Evan looked closer. The signatures were casual, friendly, as if people had signed this poster the way you'd sign a yearbook. "To RL, keep fighting, keep hoping." "RL," Clara said. "Those are the same initials from the photograph." "From the commune." "Riverlight," Evan said slowly. "RL Riverlight, that's not just a place name. That's a person." They stared at each other, the realization settling over them. All of this, the films, the photographs, the equipment, the art, belonged to someone. Someone who had been present at defining moments of the 60s and 70s. Someone who had documented history as it happened. Someone who had signed their work RL. "We need to find out who this person was," Clara said. "And why they walked away from all this," Evan added. But even as they made plans to research, to dig deeper, Evan couldn't shake a growing feeling. This wasn't just about finding valuable items anymore. They were excavating a life, uncovering someone's purpose and passion. Someone who, like him, had perhaps lost their way. The difference was, RL had left something behind, something that mattered. What would Evan leave if he disappeared tomorrow? An empty resume and unpaid bills? The thought followed him home, into restless sleep, and into dreams where he searched through endless storage units, looking for something he'd lost but couldn't name. By the end of the second week, their lives had developed a rhythm that felt almost normal. Mornings at the storage unit, afternoons researching and listing items online, evenings tallying up sales and planning the next day's work. They'd made just over $3,000 so far, selling duplicate posters and vintage magazines to collectors who seemed genuinely thrilled with their purchases. The money changed things in small but significant ways. Evan could buy groceries without calculating every dollar. Clara splashed out on Thai takeout one night, and they ate it sitting on the sagging porch, watching the sun set over the hills. They didn't talk about the future or the past, just the present moment. The taste of pad thai, the cool October air, the comfortable silence between them. "This is nice," Clara said eventually. "It is," Evan agreed, and meant it. The storage unit was roughly half cleared now, and they'd developed a better sense of what they were looking for. Everything fell into categories: film and photography equipment, protest art and political memorabilia, concert documentation, and personal effects. They handled each category differently, with varying levels of care and commercial interest. But it was the personal effects that drew Evan back again and again. The journals and notebooks, most with entries dated between 1967 and 1975. The handwriting was distinctive, confident, flowing, with occasional sketches in the margins. RL had written about art and music, about politics and community, about the struggle to create something meaningful in a world that seemed to be tearing itself apart. One entry, dated June 1970, read, "Everyone wants you to choose. Make art or make money. Create beauty or create stability. They act like you can't do both, like passion and practicality are enemies. But what if that's the lie that keeps us trapped? What if the real courage is refusing to choose?" Evan read that passage 3 times, feeling it resonate in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He'd spent his whole life choosing practicality over passion, and where had it gotten him? Laid off, divorced, living in a rental house with peeling paint. Meanwhile, RL had chosen passion, had documented history and created art, and ended up with their life's work abandoned in a storage unit. Maybe there was no right choice. Maybe you just did the best you could and hoped it was enough. Thursday afternoon, Clara made a discovery that changed everything. She was sorting through a box of what looked like personal correspondence when she pulled out a wooden case, beautifully crafted from dark mahogany. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was an acoustic guitar. not just any guitar. Even Evan, who knew nothing about instruments, could see this was something special. The wood glowed with the patina of age and use. The inlay work was intricate, and the strings, though old, were high quality. But it was the signature inside the sound hole that made Clara's breath catch. "Dad, Dad, come here right now." He crossed to where she knelt, holding the guitar like it might shatter. "Look." She angled the guitar so he could see inside. Scrawled in silver marker across the interior bracing, "To RL from JB, keep the faith." 1971. JB, Evan said. "That means something to you?" Clara was already on her phone, fingers flying. "If this is who I think it is," she turned the screen to show him. Jonathan Baxter. He was huge in the folk music scene in the late 60s and 70s. Had a massive hit with River Running in 1972, still tours occasionally, but he's a legend, and he gave this guitar to RL. Personally. This isn't a mass-produced signature. "Dad, this is a gift between friends." They sat with that knowledge for a long moment. RL hadn't just documented the counterculture movement from the sidelines. RL had been part of it, close enough to its major figures to receive personal gifts, to be trusted with private moments. "We need to be careful about selling this," Evan said slowly. "This isn't just valuable. This is personal." "I know." Clara set the guitar down gently. "It feels wrong somehow, like we're profiting off someone's friendships." It was the first time either of them had voiced what had been bothering Evan for days. Yes, they needed the money. Yes, RL had abandoned these items. But there was something uncomfortable about commodifying a life, reducing relationships and experiences to dollar amounts on auction sites. "What if we tried to find RL's family?" Clara suggested. "Maybe they'd want some of this stuff and give up the money?" "I'm not saying all of it, but maybe the really personal things. The guitar, the journals, things that aren't about market value." Evan studied his daughter, surprised and proud. When had she developed this moral compass? Or had it always been there, and he'd just been too busy being practical to notice? "Okay," he said. "Let's try to find them. But Clara, we have to be realistic. If we find family, and they have legal claim to everything, then we tell them about what we found, and hope they're decent people who recognize we did the work." It wasn't a business plan. It was a gamble based on faith in human nature, the kind of decision that made Evan's practical side scream warnings. But he found himself nodding anyway. That evening, they shifted focus from selling to investigating. Clara's research skills, honed by years of college papers and job hunting, proved invaluable. Within 2 hours, she'd traced Riverlight Collective to a specific property 10 miles outside Millfield, now abandoned. The local historical society had a file on it, accessible by appointment. "I'll call tomorrow," she said, making notes. "See what they know about RL." Evan, meanwhile, reread the journals, looking for clues. The entries were sporadic, sometimes going months between dates. But patterns emerged. RL had struggled with the tension between art and commerce, between staying true to the communal ideals and the practical needs of survival. By 1974, the commune was falling apart, members leaving for jobs and families and more conventional lives. The last entry was dated November 1975. "Everyone's gone now." The dream lasted 8 years, which is longer than most marriages. "We documented something real, something that mattered. Even if no one sees it, even if it all ends up forgotten in some basement, at least we tried. At least we refused to live small." The entry ended there, mid-thought, as if RL had been interrupted and never returned to finish. Evan felt an unexpected kinship with this person he'd never met. They'd both reached a point where everything they'd built had fallen away. The difference was, RL had built something extraordinary first. Evan had spent 18 years building nothing, just trading time for money, never creating anything that would outlast his shift. "Friday morning," Dr. Saunders called. "Mr. Strickland, I need you and your daughter to come back to Pittsburgh. Today, if possible. Is something wrong with the reels?" "Wrong? No, quite the opposite." The historian's voice carried barely contained excitement. I've examined 3 of the canisters so far, and what you've found is, well, you'd need to see this yourself. They made the drive in record time, Clara practically vibrating with anticipation. Dr. Saunders met them at the archive entrance, his wild hair wilder than usual. "I've been doing this work for 40 years, he said without preamble. "I've seen rare footage, unknown performances, lost films. But this..." He led them into a viewing room, where one of the reels sat loaded in a projector. "This is something else entirely." He dimmed the lights and started the film. The footage was remarkably clear. The 16mm film capturing details that made the past feel immediate. They were looking at a barn, dawn light streaming through open doors. Young musicians sat in a circle, some with guitars, one at a piano that had been dragged outside, others just sitting close with notebooks. "This is August 14th, 1969, Dr. Saunders said quietly, the day before Woodstock opened. These are rehearsals, but more than that, these are some of the most influential musicians of the era, just being together. No audience, no pressure, just music." The camera moved smoothly, capturing faces, instruments, moments of laughter and concentration. Whoever had filmed this knew what they were doing, knew how to frame intimacy and spontaneity. "How much is this worth?" Evan asked, his voice rough. "I can't give you an exact figure, but conservatively, based on what I've seen in just 3 reels, you're looking at 6 figures. Possibly more." Clara grabbed Evan's hand, squeezing hard. 6 figures. $100,000. Maybe more. Enough to change everything. On the drive home, neither of them spoke much. The numbers were too large, the possibilities too overwhelming. But as they pulled into Millfield, Clara said something that had been on Evan's mind too. "We still need to find RL's family." "I know. Even if it means giving this up." "I know," Evan repeated. And he did. Some things mattered more than money, even if he wasn't sure yet what those things were. The Millfield Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, painted pale yellow with white trim. The director, a woman in her 70s named Beverly Chen, met them at the door with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely got visitors interested in local history. "You're interested in Riverlight Collective?" she asked, leading them into a cluttered office filled with filing cabinets and archive boxes. "That takes me back. I was in high school when they first arrived. Thought they were the most exotic thing I'd ever seen." She pulled out a file box labeled 1960s, 1970s local communities and began spreading folders across a work table. "The collective was established in 1967 on the old Morrison farm," Beverly explained, showing them photocopied newspaper articles and photographs. About 20 people at its peak, artists and musicians mostly. They were controversial at first. You can imagine how the conservative folks in town reacted to long-haired hippies moving in. "But they contributed a lot to the community," she continued, warming to her subject. "They taught free art classes for kids, performed concerts, helped with harvest festivals. By the end, most people had come around to them." Evan studied a photograph from 1968 showing a group gathered outside a weathered farmhouse. "Do you know who led the collective?" That would be Riverlight himself. Or herself. People weren't always clear on that, and Riverlight preferred it that way. Beverly smiled at the memory. A very private person, despite being at the center of everything. Brilliant photographer and filmmaker from what I heard. "Do you know Riverlight's real name?" Clara asked. Beverly hesitated. "That's the thing. I don't think anyone in town really knew. Riverlight was very deliberate about maintaining that separation. There were rumors, of course, but..." She shrugged. "It was a different time. People respected privacy more. She showed them more materials, concert flyers, newspaper features about the commune's organic farming practices. Even a few of Riverlight's photographs that had been displayed in a local gallery in 1972. What happened to the collective?" Evan asked. "What happens to most communes, I suppose. People grew older, had children, needed steadier income. By 1975, it was basically just Riverlight left. The property was sold, and Riverlight disappeared." Beverly closed the files thoughtfully. "I always wondered what became of all their work. They documented everything, you know. Every concert, every protest, every moment they considered important. "We think we found it," Clara said quietly. Beverly's eyes widened. "The archive?" People talked about it for years, but no one knew where it went. They told her about the storage unit, about what they'd been finding. Beverly listened with growing excitement, asking to see photographs on Clara's phone, making notes about items that might have historical significance beyond monetary value. "This needs to be preserved properly," she said firmly, "not just sold off piece by piece. This is history, local and national. That's what we're trying to figure out," Evan admitted. "How to do right by it. And by Riverlight's family," Clara added. "If we can find them." Beverly pursed her lips thoughtfully. "I might be able to help with that. Give me a few days to make some calls. Some of the old commune members are still around, or their children are. Someone might know something." They left with copies of the Historical Society's files and a promise to stay in touch. Driving back to the storage unit, Evan felt the project shifting under him. What had started as a way to make quick money was becoming something else, a responsibility, a trust. "We're in over our heads," he said to Clara. "Probably," she agreed. "But it's the good kind of over our heads." At the storage unit, they'd begun to clear the final section. These boxes were the most carefully packed, labeled with precise dates and categories. Technical drawings, 1968-1970. Personal correspondence, 1967-1973. Music recordings, originals. It was in a box marked Innovations Prototypes that they found the synthesizer. The instrument was unlike anything Evan had seen. Housed in a wooden case that had been handcrafted with obvious skill, it featured a keyboard, dozens of switches and knobs, and circuitry that looked both primitive and sophisticated. Technical drawings packed alongside it showed how it was built, with notes in Riverlight's distinctive handwriting explaining the thinking behind each modification. "This is homemade," Clara said, examining the device carefully. "Hand-built from scratch." The drawings were dated 1965-1966, and the notes referenced concepts that meant nothing to Evan, but seemed to excite Clara as she researched on her phone. "Dad, this is way ahead of its time. Commercial synthesizers didn't really hit the market until the late 60s, and this," she studied the diagrams, "this has features that wouldn't become standard for years. So it's valuable? I don't know. But it's significant." She was already composing an email to a music technology professor at the State University, attaching photos and asking for an expert opinion. That afternoon, while waiting for responses, Evan took a break and walked into downtown Millfield. He'd been spending so much time at the storage unit that he hadn't really explored the town beyond the basics. Now he wandered slowly, noticing details he'd missed before. The antique shop had a display of old woodworking tools in the window. He stopped, studying them. Hand planes, chisels, a beautiful old lathe. The price tags made him wince, but it wasn't really about buying. It was about remembering. He'd loved woodworking once. His father had taught him, one of the few things they'd shared. Evan had been good at it, had made furniture for his first apartment, had talked about maybe opening a small shop someday. But then there had been bills to pay, a family to support, and factory work paid better than custom furniture. When had he stopped? He tried to remember the last thing he'd made. Clara's toy box, probably. She'd been 6. That was 23 years ago. The shop owner, seeing him linger, came to the door. "Beautiful tools, aren't they? All functional too if you're looking to start a workshop." "Just looking," Evan said. "Used to do some woodworking back in the day. Never too late to start again." The owner smiled. "I was an accountant for 30 years. Opened this place when I retired. Best decision I ever made." Evan walked on, but the man's words stayed with him. Never too late to start again. RL had written something similar in one of those journals. Every day is a chance to begin. The only real failure is refusing to try. His phone buzzed. Clara, texting, "Professor wants to see the synthesizer. Says it might be significant. Can you come back?" At the storage unit, Clara was talking with a young man who'd driven up from the university. Professor Wu was in his 30s, with the intense focus of someone in love with his subject. "This is extraordinary," he said, examining the synthesizer with gloved hands. This design predates the Moog by 2 years. Some of these circuit modifications wouldn't be patented until 1969. Whoever built this was a genuine innovator. Would museums be interested? Evan asked. Absolutely. The Science Museum in Philadelphia has a whole wing on electronic music history. This would fit perfectly. Wu looked up at them. With your permission, I'd like to write a paper about this. Credit you as the discoverers, of course. They agreed, and Wu carefully photographed everything, making detailed notes. Before he left, he mentioned that several musicians and inventors had visited communes like Riverlight in the 60s, sharing ideas and pushing creative boundaries. Your friend RL was part of a really important moment in music history, he said. Not just documenting it, but contributing to it. After he left, Clara and Evan sat in the storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of a life fully lived. Music, art, innovation, activism, RL had been present for all of it, had helped shape cultural movements that defined an era. What do you think happened? Clara asked. Why would someone who did all this just walk away? Evan thought about it, about all the journal entries he'd read, about the pattern of someone who'd chosen passion over security and then watched that choice slowly become unsustainable. Maybe they got tired, he said finally. Maybe they looked around and realized everyone else had moved on to normal lives, and they were alone with all this history that nobody seemed to care about anymore. That's sad. It is. But, he gestured at the boxes around them, they left it for someone to find. They didn't destroy it. They preserved it, kept it safe, even if they couldn't be around to see it matter. You think that's enough? Creating something, and then just hoping someone else will understand? Evan thought about the question, really considered it. A month ago, he would have said no, would have insisted on guaranteed returns and measurable outcomes. But now, sitting in this storage unit full of someone else's dreams and work and passion, he wasn't sure. Maybe it has to be, he said. Maybe you create what matters to you and trust that eventually it'll find the people who need it. Clara nodded slowly. Like it found us. Like it found us, Evan agreed. That night, his ex-wife Patricia called. How's it going out there? She asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. Clara said you're working on some kind of project. Evan told her about the storage unit, about what they'd been finding. Patricia listened, asking good questions, and he remembered why he'd married her, her sharp mind, her ability to see the heart of things. This is good for you, she said when he finished. Both of you. I can hear it in your voice. Hear what? Hope, Patricia said simply. You sound like you have hope again. After they hung up, Evan sat on the sagging porch, watching stars emerge over the hills. Hope. Such a simple word for such a complicated feeling. He did have hope, he realized. Not just for the money, though that mattered, but for something larger. He was learning something from RL, from this person he'd never met. Learning that it was possible to choose differently, to value creation over consumption, to leave something behind that mattered. It wasn't too late. He was 45, not 90. He had time to become something other than a laid-off factory worker. He just had to figure out what. 6 weeks into the project, the storage unit was nearly empty. What had once been an impenetrable wall of boxes and bags now revealed concrete floor and metal walls. Everything valuable or significant had been catalogued, photographed, and carefully stored in their rental house. The trash had been hauled away. Only a few final boxes remained, pushed against the back wall. Sales had continued steadily. Between the posters, vintage magazines, duplicate photographs, and various memorabilia, they'd accumulated nearly $45,000. Evan had paid off the credit card debt from the divorce, covered 3 months of rent in advance, and still had a cushion that let him breathe for the first time in months. But more than the money, something else had changed. He'd started taking a community education class on art history and authentication, meeting twice a week at the local community college. Clara had suggested it as a way to better understand what they were finding, but Evan discovered he genuinely enjoyed it. The instructor, a retired museum curator, treated him like a serious student, not a middle-aged man trying to fill time. "You have a good eye," she'd told him after class one evening, reviewing photos of items he'd brought to show. "You notice details. That's a skill you can develop." It had been decades since anyone had told Evan he was good at something beyond showing up on time and following instructions. Meanwhile, Clara had started documenting their discoveries on social media. Nothing that revealed too much, just intriguing glimpses of vintage items and hints about the larger story. She had a natural talent for it, crafting posts that generated engagement and built anticipation. Within 3 weeks, she had over 5,000 followers, people genuinely invested in the mystery of RL and Riverlight Collective. Some of the followers claimed to have known RL or visited the commune. Their stories were fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but patterns emerged. RL had been kind, intensely private, brilliant behind a camera. Someone who'd rather listen than talk, who documented history but stayed outside the spotlight. One comment particularly struck Evan. An elderly woman wrote, "I met Riverlight in 1969. They helped me when I needed it most, never asked for anything in return. Some people shine so bright they light up everyone around them." That was Riverlight. "I've wondered for 40 years what happened to them," Clara had replied, asking for more details, but the woman never responded again. Still, the comments stayed with Evan. He'd been so focused on what RL had created that he hadn't fully considered the person behind the work, someone who'd lived and loved and struggled and ultimately disappeared. Beverly from the Historical Society called on a Thursday morning. "I found someone who might be able to help," she said. "His name is Albert Kowalski. He was part of the commune from 1969 to 1972. He's willing to meet with you." They drove to a neighboring town that afternoon, to a modest ranch house with a well-maintained garden. Albert was in his mid-70s, lean and weathered, with kind eyes and strong hands, marked by a lifetime of work. Come in," he said, leading them to a living room filled with photographs and artwork. "Bev said you found the archive. I can't believe it's real." Over coffee, Albert told them about his time at Riverlight. He'd arrived angry and lost after returning from Vietnam, and the commune had given him a place to heal. "River, we just called them River, was the heart of it," Albert said. "Not a leader exactly, but the person everyone orbited around. Quiet, but when River spoke, you listened. Do you know River's real name?" Clara asked gently. Albert hesitated. "I do. But River was very specific about privacy, about keeping their old life separate. I'm not sure I should—" He stopped, considering. "Why are you looking for family?" Evan explained about the storage unit, about the will they'd found, about wanting to do right by the legacy, even if they were legally entitled to keep everything. Albert studied them for a long moment, then nodded as if deciding something. River's full name was Lawrence Whitmore, born in Philadelphia, 1938. Family was old money, very conservative. Lawrence was expected to take over the family business, but they wanted to make art instead. He showed them a photograph from 1970, a person in their early 30s, androgynous and striking, with intense eyes and a camera around their neck. This was RL, Lawrence Riverlight. The family cut Lawrence off completely when they joined the counterculture movement, Albert continued. Said they'd rather have no child than a hippie embarrassment. Lawrence took the name Riverlight and never looked back. Did Lawrence have children? Clara asked. 2. A son and daughter from a brief marriage in the late 50s, before everything. But the marriage ended badly, and the ex-spouse poisoned the kids against Lawrence. Told them their parent had abandoned them for drugs and free love. Albert's voice carried old anger. It wasn't true. Lawrence tried to maintain contact, but the kids wanted nothing to do with them. Are they still alive? Evan asked. Last I heard, yes. The son, Gerald, is in his 60s, lives in Ohio. The daughter, Ruth, is younger, late 50s maybe, somewhere in New Jersey. But Albert leaned forward. They were bitter about Lawrence's choices. Refused to understand or forgive. When Lawrence died in 1992, neither of them came to the memorial. Lawrence died. Clara's voice was small. Cancer. Quick and not kind. Albert's eyes grew distant. By then, most of us from the commune had scattered. I made it back for the memorial, just a handful of us, remembering someone who'd meant everything to us and nothing to the world at large. The room was quiet for a moment, heavy with the weight of a life concluded. The storage unit, Evan said slowly. Did you know about it? Lawrence mentioned setting something up, a kind of time capsule. Said the work mattered, even if nobody appreciated it at the time. Said maybe someday someone would find it and understand. Albert smiled sadly. Typical Lawrence. Always thinking decades ahead, always believing in eventual meaning. He showed them more photographs, told more stories. Lawrence documenting protests, Lawrence teaching local kids about photography, Lawrence working late into the night on film editing, driven by a vision of preserving truth as they saw it. Here's what you need to understand, Albert said as they prepared to leave. Lawrence's children rejected everything they stood for. They wanted Lawrence to be conventional, to be ashamed of who they were. Lawrence refused, and it cost them their family. He met Evan's eyes directly. Those kids have legal rights, maybe, but moral rights? They gave those up when they turned their back on someone who was trying to change the world. Driving home, neither Evan nor Clara spoke for a long time. Finally, Clara broke the silence. We still need to contact them. I know, even though they don't deserve it. Especially because they don't deserve it, Evan said. We do the right thing because it's right, not because people earned it. But the knowledge sat heavy in his stomach. Lawrence had died alone, their life's work packed away, their children absent. And now those same children might swoop in to claim value they'd never appreciated. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Lawrence, about choosing passion over family approval, about dying with your work unrecognized. Was that courage or tragedy? Both, maybe. The two weren't mutually exclusive. He got up and went to Clara's room, where she sat cross-legged on her bed, laptop open, working on something. Can't sleep either, she asked, thinking about Lawrence. About choices, Clara nodded. Me too. Dad, can I show you something? She turned her laptop around. On the screen was a portfolio website, half-built but promising. Photography, graphic design, her recent documentation of their storage unit discoveries. I've been working on this at night, she said, thinking about what I actually want to do, not what I thought I should do. It's beautiful, Evan said, and meant it. I dropped graphic design because you and Mom were getting divorced, and I thought I needed to be practical. But she gestured at the screen. This is what I love. This is what I'm good at. Then do it, Evan said simply. Even if it doesn't make money right away? Even if it's risky? He thought about Lawrence, about a life spent creating things that mattered even if the world didn't immediately recognize it, about how that life had eventually found its way to two people who needed it desperately, especially then, he said. Because the alternative is spending 45 years doing something that doesn't matter and waking up one day with nothing to show for it but regrets. Clara looked at him with new understanding. Is that how you feel? It was, Evan admitted. But finding Lawrence's work, it's teaching me something. It's never too late to start mattering. They sat together in comfortable silence, father and daughter, both reimagining their futures by the light of someone else's past. The next morning, Evan made the call to Gerald Whitmore. The conversation was brief and cold. Gerald listened to Evan's explanation with barely concealed impatience. My father was a disappointment and an embarrassment, Gerald said flatly. Whatever junk he left behind, you're welcome to it. I want nothing to do with any of it. There are items of significant value, Evan tried. I don't care. My father chose strangers and causes over his own children. You're more his family than I ever was. The bitterness was sharp enough to cut. Do whatever you want. Don't contact me again. The call to Ruth went similarly, though she at least had the grace to sound sad beneath the anger. I tried to have a relationship with my parents, she said, but they were always somewhere else, always with some cause or community or project. We weren't enough. We were never enough. She paused. If you found something valuable, good for you. I don't want it. I don't want any reminders. After both calls, Evan felt oddly empty. He'd expected relief. They were legally clear to keep everything, but instead he felt the echo of old pain. Families broken by choices neither side could forgive. They signed away their rights, Clara said when he told her. We can move forward with clear conscience. Or can we? Evan asked. Lawrence died alone because they chose art over family. Now we're profiting from that choice. No, Clara said firmly. Lawrence died alone because their children couldn't accept who they were. That's different. She touched his arm. We're not profiting from someone's pain, Dad. We're giving their work the recognition it deserves. That's what Lawrence wanted. Someone to find it and understand it mattered. She was right. Evan knew she was right. But still, the sadness lingered. They returned to the storage unit to clear out the last few boxes, determined to finish what they'd started. The final boxes sat in the back corner of the storage unit like sentinels guarding secrets. Evan and Clara had been putting them off, partly from superstition. Finishing meant the project was over, and partly from a vague sense that something important waited there. It was a grey Saturday morning, rain drumming on the metal roof, when they finally pulled the boxes into the light. The first contained more journals, these from the final years. Evan read entries from 1990 and 1991, watching Lawrence's handwriting grow shakier, the entries shorter. There were mentions of doctor's appointments, of treatments, of time running out. Lawrence had known they were dying and had prepared accordingly. Clara, Evan said quietly, you should read this. The entry was dated March 1991. Made arrangements today. Storage unit paid through trust for 30 years. Should be enough. If the work matters, someone will find it before then. If it doesn't, at least I tried to preserve it. Gerald and Ruth have made their choices. I've made mine. No regrets about the life I lived, only about the relationships I couldn't salvage. Clara read it twice, her eyes bright with unshed tears. They knew, they planned all of this. Keep reading, Evan said. The next entries detailed Lawrence's preparations, cataloguing items, packing them carefully, writing instructions that apparently had been left with the storage facility but never followed. And then, in an entry from June 1991, a surprising revelation. Saw lawyer today, drew up a proper will, not that I have much to leave, but the archive, that matters. I want it to go to whoever finds it and sees its value, not my children who rejected everything I stood for, not the commune members who've moved on to their own lives, but to someone who needs it, someone like I was once, lost, searching, needing to believe that choosing passion over safety isn't always foolish. Wait, Clara said, looking up. Lawrence left a will specifically about the archive. They dug deeper into the box. At the bottom, wrapped in waterproof plastic, was a metal document box. Inside, legal papers, notarized and official. The last will and testament of Lawrence River Whitmore was dated July 1991. It was brief and specific. After small bequests to a few old friends, the bulk of the document dealt with the storage unit. To whoever discovers the contents of Valley Storage Unit 47 and recognizes their worth, I leave all my work, my equipment, and my documentation. This is not abandonment. It is faith. Faith that someone will come along who understands that preserving truth and beauty matters, even when the world doesn't seem to care. My children wanted nothing to do with my life's work while I lived. I will not force it upon them in death. Let it find someone who will value it. Attached to the will was a letter, handwritten on yellowed paper. Dear Finder, if you're reading this, then my plan worked. 30 years have passed. The storage. Payment lapsed and someone with curiosity opened that door. I hope you found more than junk. I hope you found evidence that the 60s and 70s, for all their chaos, mattered. That the people who fought for peace and equality and artistic freedom left something behind worth preserving. But more than that, I hope you found something for yourself. I don't know who you are or what brought you to that storage unit, but I like to think it was more than chance. Maybe you needed to discover that it's never too late to choose differently. Maybe you needed proof that living authentically, even when it costs you everything, is worth it. My family rejected me for refusing to live small. They wanted me to be conventional, profitable, respectable. I wanted to make art and document truth. We couldn't find middle ground, and that's the great sadness of my life. But I don't regret the choice. I only regret that they couldn't understand it. If you're struggling with similar choices, security versus passion, what's expected versus what's true, let my work be evidence that the hard road isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's the only one worth taking. The archive is yours now. Sell it, donate it, treasure it, whatever serves your purpose. Just promise me one thing. Remember that it mattered. The concerts, the protests, the commune, the art, all of it mattered because we believed it did. And belief, even without immediate proof, is its own kind of courage. Begin again whenever you need to. The only real failure is refusing to try. With hope, Lawrence River Whitmore, July 1991. Evan read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Clara sat beside him, tears running freely down her cheeks. "They left it for us," she whispered. "Not specifically us, but someone like us. Someone who needed it." Evan couldn't speak. The letter felt like a message across time, from someone who understood exactly what he was feeling. Lawrence had been there, at the crossroads of safety and risk, convention and authenticity, and Lawrence had chosen, had lived with the consequences, and had tried to leave something behind that might help the next person facing the same choice. "Dad, this changes everything," Clara said. "We're not just lucky people who stumbled onto something valuable. We're who Lawrence was waiting for." The legal documents were clear. Dale, the storage manager, should have checked for a will before offering the contents to them, but his oversight had ironically fulfilled Lawrence's wishes anyway. The will explicitly released the storage facility from responsibility and granted full ownership to whoever discovered and recognized the archive's worth. "We need to show this to a lawyer," Evan said, his practical side asserting itself. "Make sure it's all legal." "It is," Clara said, still reading. "Look, Lawrence named the storage facility as executor. They were supposed to find someone to clear it out if payments lapsed, which is exactly what Dale did. They sat in the empty storage unit, rain pattering above them, holding papers that transformed their windfall from luck into legacy. Lawrence had planned this, had believed someone would come along who needed the archive as much as the archive needed to be found. "We should still reach out to Gerald and Ruth," Evan said. "Tell them about the will. Give them one more chance." Clara nodded. "But when they say no, and they will, we can move forward knowing we did everything right." That evening, Evan composed an email to both of Lawrence's children, explaining about the will, about their father's explicit wishes, about the option to contest if they chose. He kept it brief and respectful, attaching scans of the relevant documents. Gerald's response came within an hour. "My father made his choices. I've made mine. The will confirms what I already told you. Don't contact me again." Ruth took until the next morning, but her reply was similar. "I appreciate you reaching out, but seeing proof that my parent planned to give everything to strangers rather than family just confirms what I always knew. We weren't wanted. Keep it all. I'm done grieving for someone who never wanted to be my parent." Evan showed Clara the responses. She read them sadly but without surprise. "They're still so hurt," she said. "After all these years? Some wounds don't heal," Evan replied, "especially when both sides are convinced they're right." "Do you think Lawrence was wrong, choosing art over family?" Evan thought about it carefully. "I think Lawrence was human, made choices, some good, some not. Tried to be true to themselves in a time when that was harder than we can imagine. The art wasn't instead of family, it was who Lawrence was. The tragedy is that their family couldn't accept it." He paused, then continued. "But I also think Lawrence learned something. That letter, that will, it's not just about the archive. It's an apology in a way, an admission that maybe both choices cost too much." Clara nodded slowly. "That's what makes it so sad. Lawrence figured it out, but too late to fix it. Or maybe Evan picked up the letter again. Maybe this is how Lawrence tried to fix it. Not with their own children, but with someone else's family. With us. The realization settled over both of them. Lawrence hadn't just left them an archive. They'd left them a chance to learn from mistakes, to choose differently, to find balance between passion and connection. We almost lost this, didn't we? Clara said quietly. I mean us, our relationship. If we hadn't found this storage unit. I know, Evan said. I was so focused on being practical, on doing what I thought was right, I forgot to actually live. Forgot to see you, forgot to see myself. And I was so busy trying to be what everyone needed that I forgot what I wanted. They sat together in the empty unit, father and daughter, two people who'd been drifting apart until a stranger's abandoned dreams brought them back together. So what now? Clara asked. Evan looked around the storage unit, empty now, just concrete and metal, no longer holding anything but possibility. Now we honor Lawrence's wish, he said. We make sure the archive gets recognized. We set up our own lives based on what we learned here, and we don't make the same mistakes. We find a way to be authentic without losing each other. That sounds good, Clara said. That sounds really good. They loaded the final boxes, the will, the letter, the last journals, into the truck. Tomorrow, they'd meet with lawyers and museum curators, would begin the formal process of establishing Lawrence's legacy. But tonight, they'd go home to their rental house with peeling paint and sit on the sagging porch and talk about the future. Not the future they'd expected or planned for, but the one they were choosing, together, with eyes wide open to both risk and possibility. As Evan pulled the storage unit door closed for the last time, he touched the metal frame, a small gesture of gratitude to Lawrence, to chance, to whatever forces had led him to that rusted door on a Saturday morning when he'd still believed his life was over. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time he'd do it right. The lawyer confirmed what they'd hoped. Lawrence's will was legally sound, properly executed, and clearly stated. The storage facility had acted as unwitting executor exactly as intended. Evan and Clara were the rightful owners of everything they'd found, with Lawrence's explicit blessing from beyond the grave. This is actually quite beautiful, the lawyer said, a woman in her 50s named Angela Porter. I've never seen someone plan a legacy quite like this. Most people try to control everything from the grave. Your Mr. Whitmore trusted the universe to send the right person. With legal clarity came momentum. Dr. Saunders had finished examining all 17 film reels and was preparing a comprehensive authentication report. His preliminary assessment, delivered over the phone with barely contained excitement, suggested the collection was worth significantly more than his initial estimate. These aren't just concert recordings, he explained. They're anthropological documents. Lawrence captured intimate moments, backstage conversations, the human reality behind the mythology. Museums will compete for this, but it was Beverly from the Historical Society who helped them see the bigger picture. You need an exhibition, she said over coffee at May's place. Before you sell anything to museums, you need to show the community what Lawrence created. Let people understand the whole story. The idea took root immediately. An exhibition would honor Lawrence's work properly, would let people see the context before items scattered to different institutions. It would also generate publicity that could increase value, though by this point, Evan cared less about maximum profit than about doing justice to the legacy. They had 2 months to make it happen. Beverly secured gallery space at the Millfield Community Arts Center. A converted church with high ceilings and good lighting, Dr. Saunders agreed to curate the film portion, selecting key clips that could be shown safely without damaging the originals. Professor Wu wanted to display the synthesizer alongside technical drawings and explanations of its innovations. Clara took charge of the visual presentation, applying skills from her abandoned graphic design studies. She created panels explaining the counterculture movement, the commune's history, Lawrence's life and philosophy. She arranged photographs chronologically, showing the evolution of style and subject matter. She even tracked down some of the people who appeared in Lawrence's photographs, collecting their memories and stories. Evan found himself with an unexpected role. He was asked to speak at the exhibition opening. The thought terrified him. Public speaking had never been his strength, and what did he have to say that mattered? He was just someone who'd gotten lucky with a storage unit. But Clara insisted, "You need to tell people what this meant to you, what Lawrence's letter meant. That's the story people need to hear." He started writing a speech, throwing away draft after draft. Everything sounded either too casual or too formal, too personal or too distant. He couldn't find the right voice. It was Lawrence's journals that finally helped. Reading them in the evenings, Evan began to understand how Lawrence thought, how they'd structured ideas. Lawrence wrote the way they'd lived, honestly, directly, without pretense. Evan tried to channel that in his own words. Meanwhile, the documentary filmmaker who'd been following their journey asked to include the exhibition as the climax of his film. He'd been capturing footage throughout, interviewing Evan and Clara, filming them at work in the storage unit. Now he wanted to show the culmination, Lawrence's work finally receiving recognition. "This isn't just about found treasure," the filmmaker explained. "It's about how we preserve history, how legacies find their moment. And honestly, it's about second chances. Yours and Clara's as much as Lawrence's." Evan agreed, though being filmed made him self-conscious. The camera caught moments he didn't realize were significant. His hands carefully unwrapping an artifact. His face when reading journal entries. The quiet conversations with Clara about what they'd learned. 6 weeks before the exhibition, Patricia drove up from their old town to visit. She'd remarried. Evan had congratulated her sincerely and wanted to see what her daughter and ex-husband were building. She walked through their rental house, where every surface held carefully organized archive materials. She looked at Clara's portfolio website, now live and already generating freelance inquiries. She listened to Evan talk about the community education classes he was taking, about his tentative plans to start doing woodworking again. "You both seem different," she said finally, sitting on the porch with them as evening fell. "Lighter somehow." "We found something we needed," Clara said simply. "Each other?" Patricia asked. "That too," Evan admitted. "But also purpose, I guess. Something that matters." Patricia smiled. "I'm glad." "I worried about both of you," she paused. "Especially you, Evan. You were so lost." "I was," he acknowledged. "Still finding my way, but at least now I'm looking." She stayed for dinner. Clara's cooking had improved dramatically. Necessity being an excellent teacher, and they talked like old friends rather than former spouses. The bitterness had faded, replaced by genuine good wishes for each other's futures. "Your new husband?" Evan asked carefully. "Is he good to you?" "He is," Patricia said. "But more than that, I'm good to me now. I figured out what I need. Took me long enough." After she left, Clara said, "That wasn't as weird as I expected." "No," Evan agreed. "It was actually nice. With 3 weeks until the exhibition, real pressure mounted. Items needed to be properly framed and mounted. Insurance had to be arranged. The collection's total value now exceeded $600,000. Security for the exhibition required coordination with local police. Dr. Saunders arrived with museum representatives from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C. They toured the collection privately, took notes, asked detailed questions about provenance and condition. Each expressed serious interest in acquiring pieces, though they acknowledged an ethical exhibition should come first. "This is significant American cultural history," the Smithsonian representative said. "Whatever you decide to do with the collection, we'd like to be considered." The money they were discussing was staggering. Even selling only half the collection to museums, keeping the rest for future opportunities, Evan and Clara would have financial security for years. Clara could pursue photography full-time. Evan could open a small woodworking shop, take on only projects he found meaningful. But Evan found himself thinking less about the money and more about responsibility. Lawrence had trusted someone to understand what mattered. Was he living up to that trust? He talked to Albert, the former commune member, who came to preview the exhibition setup. Lawrence would be proud. Albert said, walking slowly through the gallery space. This is exactly what they wanted. The work recognized, the story told truthfully. Did Lawrence ever talk about regrets? Evan asked. About the cost of their choices. Albert considered carefully. Lawrence regretted the distance from their children, wished it could have been different. But they never regretted the work itself, the life they led. They believed some things are worth sacrifice, he paused. The tragedy was that both sides sacrificed so much, and neither felt they got what they needed. That conversation stuck with Evan as he continued refining his speech. Lawrence's story wasn't a simple morality tale about following your dreams. It was more complex, about the genuine costs of living authentically, about how being true to yourself sometimes meant losing people you loved, about how there weren't easy answers. But it was also about believing that what you create matters, even if recognition comes late or never. About trusting that someone eventually would understand. 1 week before opening night, everything came together. The gallery looked stunning. Clara's design work, creating a coherent narrative flow through Lawrence's life and art. Film clips played on loop, showing moments of cultural history captured with intimacy and skill. The synthesizer sat in a glass case, surrounded by technical drawings that explained its innovations. Evan practiced his speech in the empty gallery, his voice echoing off high ceilings. Clara sat in the back row listening, offering suggestions. You need to talk about the letter, she said. That's the emotional heart of this. It feels too personal. It is personal. That's why it matters. He revised again, including more about finding the letter, about what it meant to receive guidance from someone who'd faced similar struggles. About how Lawrence's words across 30 years had helped him see his own life differently. The night before the opening, Evan couldn't sleep. He stood in the gallery at midnight. Beverly had given him a key, looking at everything they'd built. Lawrence's photographs lined the walls. Lawrence's innovations sat in careful display. Lawrence's words filled explanatory panels. But what moved Evan most was a small addition Clara had made. A photograph of the storage unit door, rusted and dented, with a simple caption, "Where it all began." That door had changed everything. Behind it had been not just valuable artifacts, but a message that he'd needed desperately. It's never too late to begin again. He read Lawrence's letter one more time, the original now safely framed near the entrance where every visitor would see it. Begin again whenever you need to. The only real failure is refusing to try. Tomorrow people would come to see Lawrence's work. They'd learn about the counterculture movement, about artistic innovation, about a life lived with fierce authenticity. But Evan hoped they'd also see something more. Evidence that choosing what matters, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, is still worth doing. He went home and slept peacefully, ready for what was coming. Ready to honor Lawrence's legacy, and maybe, in doing so, to build his own. The gallery filled quickly, far exceeding their expectations. By 7 o'clock, over 200 people crowded the space. Local residents, art historians, former commune members who'd traveled from across the country. Journalists covering the story of Lawrence's rediscovered archive. Evan stood near the entrance in a suit he'd bought that afternoon, uncomfortable but presentable. Clara had helped him with the tie, her hand steady where his shook. "You've got this, Dad," she'd whispered. "Just speak from the heart." Now, watching strangers examine Lawrence's photographs with genuine reverence, Evan felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. These people had come to honor someone they'd never met, based on work that had been hidden for 3 decades. He had to get this right. Beverly approached, radiant in a blue dress. 5 minutes until we start. "Are you ready?" "No," Evan admitted. "But I'll do it anyway." The gallery lights dimmed slightly, and Beverly called for attention. The crowd settled, turning toward the small podium where Evan would speak. Behind him, Lawrence's self-portrait from 1974 dominated the wall. A powerful image of someone confident in their purpose, camera in hand, eyes direct and unflinching. Beverly's introduction was warm but brief. Then Evan stepped to the podium, notes in hand, though he knew he wouldn't need them. He'd memorized every word, had lived with them for days. He began with the storage unit door, describing that Saturday morning 3 months ago when he and Clara had pulled it open expecting garbage. His voice was shaky at first, but steadied as he found his rhythm. "I was 45 years old and I'd forgotten how to hope," he said, and the room went absolutely still. "Laid off after 18 years, divorced, living in a rental house with my daughter, both of us trying to figure out what came next. When the storage manager offered us that unit, I almost said no. What did I need with more junk?" He described the first discoveries, the growing realization that they'd found something extraordinary. He talked about the film reels, the protest art, the innovations that had been ahead of their time. "But what changed everything," Evan continued, his voice catching slightly, "was finding Lawrence's letter." He gestured to the framed document near the entrance. Several people turned to read it, even though copies were available throughout the gallery. Lawrence wrote that letter in 1991, knowing they were dying, knowing they'd never see if anyone found what they'd left behind. They wrote it anyway, because they believed it mattered, because they had faith that someone would come along who needed to hear what they had to say. Evan paused, gathering himself. This was the hard part, the personal part. I needed to hear it. I needed someone to tell me it's never too late to begin again. That choosing what matters, even when it's hard, is worth it. That creating something meaningful is its own kind of courage. He looked at Clara, standing near the back of the room, tears already streaming down her face. She nodded encouragement. Lawrence paid a price for their choices. Their family couldn't accept who they were, couldn't understand why art and documentation and community mattered more than conventional success. Lawrence died estranged from their children, their life's work packed in boxes, unknown and unappreciated. The room was silent, the weight of that tragedy palpable. But here's what Lawrence understood that took me 45 years to learn. You don't create for recognition. You create because it's who you are. You preserve truth because it matters, whether anyone ever sees it or not. You live authentically because the alternative is a kind of death. Evan's hands no longer shook. The words came easily now, naturally, like he'd been preparing his whole life to say them. This exhibition isn't just about honoring Lawrence Whitmore, though we do honor them. It's not just about preserving important historical documentation, though that matters too. It's about recognizing that everyone has a choice, safety or truth, convention or authenticity, living small or living fully. He looked around the gallery, meeting eyes, seeing people lean forward. Lawrence chose truth. It cost them their family, cost them recognition in their lifetime, cost them almost everything. But it gave them purpose. It gave them meaning. And 30 years after their death, it gave two lost people, me and my daughter, a reason to believe in themselves again. His voice grew stronger, more certain. That's Lawrence's real legacy. Not just the photographs and films and innovations on these walls, but the message that it's never too late, that you can be 45 and divorced and laid off and still find purpose, that you can be 22 and uncertain and still choose passion over practicality, that beginning again at any age is always possible. Evan looked back at Lawrence's portrait, at those confident eyes staring into the future. Thank you, Lawrence, for believing someone would come along. Thank you for having faith that your work would find the people who needed it most. And thank you, his voice broke. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to become who I was meant to be. The gallery erupted in applause. Evan stood there overwhelmed as people rose to their feet. He found Clara in the crowd, saw Patricia standing beside her. When had his ex-wife arrived? Both were crying, both were smiling, both were proud. Beverly hugged him as he stepped down from the podium. "That was perfect," she whispered. But Evan wasn't thinking about his speech anymore. He was watching people move through the gallery with new purpose, reading Lawrence's words, examining the photographs, understanding not just what Lawrence had documented, but why it mattered. This was what legacy looked like. Not fame or fortune, but connection across time. One person's truth helping another person find theirs. The documentary cameras captured everything, but Evan barely noticed. He moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, but his mind was already ahead, already planning. Tomorrow, he'd start building something of his own. Not for recognition or money, but because that's what Lawrence had taught him. Create what matters, and trust that eventually it will find who needs it. Later that evening, after most of the crowd had dispersed, Evan found himself standing before Lawrence's self-portrait with a small group of people who'd stayed behind. Albert was there, along with 3 other former commune members who'd made the journey to honor their old friend. Lawrence would have hated all this attention, one of them said, a woman named Francine with silver hair and kind eyes. But they would have loved knowing the work mattered. "Tell me about them," Evan said. The real Lawrence, not just the artist. They shared stories for over an hour. Lawrence making breakfast for 30 people every Sunday. Lawrence teaching neighborhood kids about photography, never charging a cent. Lawrence sitting up all night with someone going through a crisis, just listening. Lawrence dancing badly at commune parties, self-conscious but willing. Lawrence crying at injustice, celebrating small victories, believing fiercely that the world could be better. They weren't perfect, Albert said. Got stubborn about principles, could be difficult when they thought something mattered. The estrangement from their kids, that was complicated. Lawrence tried, but they also had firm boundaries about authenticity. Wouldn't pretend to be someone they weren't, even for family. Was that right? Evan asked. Albert shrugged. Who's to say? Both sides were hurt. Both sides were trying to be true to themselves. Sometimes that's how it goes. No villains, just people who couldn't find common ground. As the former commune members prepared to leave, Francine pulled Evan aside. "There's something you should have." She handed him a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "Lawrence gave this to me in 1989, said to keep it safe. I think it's meant for you now." Inside was a wooden box, beautifully crafted from dark walnut. The joinery was exquisite, dovetails so tight they seemed to flow together, a finish that glowed with care and skill. On the lid, carved in simple letters, "Begin." Evan opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a smooth river stone with a single word carved into its surface. "Begin." A note accompanied it. In Lawrence's handwriting, "My mentor gave me this stone in 1965 when I was ready to give up on everything. He said, whenever you're lost, you can begin again. I carried it for 26 years, began again more times than I can count. Now I leave it for whoever comes next. Pass it on when your time comes." Evan's vision blurred. He held the stone, feeling its weight, its solidity. Lawrence had carried this through protests and concerts, through the creation of the commune and its dissolution, through estrangement and illness. It had been a touchstone for someone trying to live authentically in a world that demanded conformity. Now it was his. Clara appeared at his elbow, reading the note over his shoulder. "Dad," she whispered. "I know. Lawrence made that box. The woodworking, look at it." Evan examined the box more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the work of someone who understood wood grain and joinery at a deep level. Lawrence hadn't just been a filmmaker and photographer. They'd been a woodworker too, had created beauty with their hands as well as their lens. "They were like you," Clara said softly. "They gave it up for other things, but they never forgot." The museum representatives approached, diplomatically waiting until the emotional moment had passed before discussing business. They'd reviewed the collection thoroughly and were prepared to make offers. The Smithsonian wanted the film archive. Philadelphia wanted the protest art. Pittsburgh wanted the technical innovations. The numbers they proposed were staggering, over $400,000 total, with the remaining items likely to sell for another $200,000 at auction. More money than Evan had earned in a decade of factory work. But he barely heard the details. His hand closed around the stone, feeling the carved word against his palm. "Begin. We'll need time to consider everything," Clara was saying, handling the business with competence that made Evan proud. "We'll have our lawyer review the offers and get back to you within the week." After the representatives left, only Evan, Clara, Beverly, and the documentary crew remained. The filmmaker was getting final shots of the empty gallery, the light still illuminating Lawrence's work. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked Evan. "I'm thinking about woodworking," he admitted. "About that box, about the skill it took. Lawrence had multiple gifts." "So do I, maybe. So do you. What does that mean?" "It means we use the money wisely, set up properly. You pursue photography, I start a real workshop. We create things that matter to us, and we don't apologize for it." Clara smiled. "Lawrence would approve." "Lawrence did approve," Evan corrected, holding up the stone. "This is permission. This is a blessing from someone who walked the path before us." They stood together in the gallery, surrounded by evidence of a life fully lived. Outside, Millfield's streets were quiet, the small town settling into night. But inside, possibility hummed in the air. Patricia emerged from where she'd been examining photographs. "I'm proud of both of you," she said simply. "Not because of the money or the success, because you found something true." The three of them, former family, current friends, stood in comfortable silence. So much had changed in 3 months. So much more would change in the months to come. But for now, this moment was enough. Recognition for Lawrence, purpose for Evan and Clara, and a stone that promised beginning again was always possible. Evan pocketed the stone carefully. He'd carry it the way Lawrence had, a reminder that every day offered the chance to choose differently. To choose truth over safety, creation over consumption, meaning over money. The gallery lights dimmed as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring contracts and decisions, logistics and planning. But tonight was for gratitude, for Lawrence's gift, for Clara's partnership, for the strange grace of finding exactly what you need in the last place you'd think to look. In the parking lot, Clara hugged him tight. "We did good, Dad." "We did," Evan agreed. "And we're just getting started." Above them, stars emerged in the October sky, ancient light traveling impossible distances to reach watching eyes. Just like Lawrence's message, traveling 30 years to reach the people who needed it most. Everything finds its moment eventually. You just have to be ready when it arrives. 3 months after the exhibition, Evan stood in front of a small storefront on Millfield's Main Street, installing a hand-carved wooden sign. The letters had taken him 2 weeks to get right, each one shaped and sanded until they felt perfect under his fingertips. Strickland and daughter, fine crafts. Clara stood beside him, camera in hand, documenting the moment. She'd done that a lot lately, capturing the transformation of an empty retail space into a working studio. Her photographs would become part of a portfolio she was building, a visual story of new beginnings. "It's perfect, Dad," she said, snapping one more shot as he stepped back to admire his work. The sign was made from reclaimed walnut, the same wood Lawrence had used for the box that held the begin stone. Evan had sourced it carefully, learned its properties, understood how to work with its grain. The joinery was clean, the finish rich and warm. It was, he knew, the best work he'd ever done. Inside, the shop was organized but still finding its rhythm. Evan's woodworking tools lined one wall, some old ones he'd kept in storage, some new ones purchased with money from the museum sales. Clara's photography corner occupied the back, with a computer, printer and samples of her work displayed on the walls. They'd kept half of what the museums had paid, $200,000, and invested it carefully. The shop's rent was covered for 2 years. Equipment was quality, but not extravagant. They had enough cushion to survive while building clientele, enough security to take risks. The other half had gone to establishing the Lawrence Whitmore Archive Fund, managed by the Millfield Historical Society. The fund would preserve counterculture documentation, support emerging artists, and offer grants to people trying to live authentically despite financial pressure. It was what Lawrence would have wanted, the money continuing to help others begin again. Beverly had cried when they told her about the fund. "This is exactly right," she'd said. "Lawrence's work keeps giving." The documentary about their discovery had premiered the previous month at a film festival, winning an Audience Choice Award. The exposure had brought unexpected attention, people reaching out to share their own stories of finding meaning in unexpected places, of starting over after loss, of learning to value creation over consumption. Clara's social media following had grown to over 50,000. She'd been careful about it, maintaining the reflective tone that had attracted people in the first place. She shared her photography, Evan's woodworking progress, thoughts about art and purpose, and the courage required to live differently. Companies had approached her about sponsorships, but she'd turned them down. This wasn't about building a brand. It was about building a life. Evan's first commission had come from Dr. Saunders, a custom display case for a rare film reel collection. The work had been challenging, requiring precision and creativity. Evan had loved every minute of it, staying up late in the workshop, losing himself in the satisfaction of making something beautiful and functional. Other commissions followed. A farmer's market vendor needed display shelving. A local restaurant wanted custom tables. A young couple commissioned a cradle for their first baby. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make him rich, but work that mattered to the people who needed it. That was enough. Patricia visited regularly now, sometimes bringing her new husband. The four of them had dinner together once a month, an easy friendship replacing the awkward tension of divorce. She'd started taking watercolor classes, pursuing a creativity she'd suppressed for years. "You inspired me," she'd told Evan. "If you can start over at 45, I can start over at 47. Today was the official grand opening, though they'd been working out of the space for weeks. Friends came by throughout the afternoon. Beverly, Albert, some of the former commune members who'd stayed in touch, people from Evan's art history class, customers who'd commissioned work. Dale from the storage facility appeared around 3, looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt. "Thought I should see what became of all that junk," he said gruffly, but his eyes were warm. "Want to see something?" Evan asked, leading him to a small display case near the window. Inside was Lawrence's Begin stone, mounted on a velvet cushion with a small plaque explaining its history. "For inspiration, not for sale," the sign read. Next to it sat photographs of the storage unit, before and after, and a copy of Lawrence's letter. "That's something," Dale said quietly. "All that was sitting in my facility for 30 years, and I never knew. You knew enough to offer it to someone who needed it," Evan said. "That's what mattered." As evening approached and visitors thinned, Evan and Clara found themselves alone in the shop. They moved through the space, straightening displays, turning off unnecessary lights, settling into the comfortable routine they'd developed. "You happy?" Clara asked. Evan considered the question seriously. Was he happy? He had less money than before the layoff, less security, less certainty about the future. He worked longer hours for less immediate return. There were days he worried about making rent, about whether anyone would actually buy what he made. But he also woke up eager to start working. He went to bed satisfied with what he'd accomplished. He knew his daughter not just as his child, but as his partner and friend. He created things that would outlast him, that would carry his care and skill into other people's lives. "Yeah," he said. "I'm happy." Clara hugged him, and they stood together in the workshop's fading light. Through the window, Main Street stretched away, quiet in the autumn evening. Somewhere out there, other people were standing at their own crossroads, deciding between safety and truth, convention and authenticity. Evan hoped they'd find their own storage unit, their own message across time, their own permission to begin again. He pulled the Begin stone from his pocket. He carried it everywhere now, a touchstone when doubt crept in. Someday, when someone else needed it more than he did, he'd pass it on. But not yet. He was still beginning, still learning, still figuring out who he was meant to be. That was the thing about beginning again. It wasn't a single moment, but a continuous choice. Every morning, you could decide to live authentically or play it safe. Every day offered the chance to create something meaningful or settle for less. Lawrence had understood that, had lived it for decades, had died believing it mattered even if no one saw. And now, because of a rusty storage unit door and a father and daughter desperate enough to look beyond the surface, Lawrence's message continued. The work mattered. The choice mattered. Living fully, authentically, courageously, that mattered most of all. Evan locked the shop door, Clara beside him, both of them carrying Lawrence's legacy forward in their own way. Tomorrow they'd open again, serve whoever needed what they offered, create a little more beauty in a world that needed it. But tonight, walking home through the quiet streets of Millfield, Evan simply felt grateful. Grateful for the chance to start over. Grateful for the daughter who'd stayed beside him. Grateful for a stranger's faith that someone would come along who needed to hear, "It's never too late to begin again." Sometimes life knocks you down so hard you forget how to hope. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find a rusted door that changes everything. Sometimes the junk turns out to be treasure. And sometimes the treasure turns out to be yourself waiting to be discovered.